55T
Marius,
Athlon
and
X6
Sulla, and eventually
running
a
at
guy named
3.4.
Caesar, to take the Roman military and use it to dominate Rome. So 100 years after this time, 150 years after
And then
this
a
time, when
6870,
Carthage is but a
two of
memory,
them, Crossfire.
a vicious, bloody,
old
scary
computer.
memory to the Romans. The poison that the Carthaginians had injected in the Roman system destroyed the Roman Republic. And somewhere, you get a little bit of feeling that a guy named Hamilcar, or wherever he might be, and his 3 sons, the Lion's Brood,
Watch these explosions.
had a smile on their face, feeling that somehow, some way, justice had been done.
Oh shit. Run away.
Audible is the internet's leading provider of spoken audio entertainment, providing digital versions of tens of
Oh, my
thousands of
mic?
audiobooks
Oh, I don't
for
even
download
know.
to your computer, your
It's-
iPod, or your MP3
crappy.
player. You can listen wherever and whenever you like, just like you're listening to this podcast right now. And Audible has more than...
I'm listening to a podcast. Hope you're not talking about me. Anyways, I'm in the middle of a battle. Okay, I need to assess the situation here. This is serious shit. I don't need to lose my entire fucking army. Okay, my bow guys did run the hell away. Okay, get your asses over here. Hurry. And I got these bow guys. I'll have you go right here. Over here. You retreated very safely. That's great. I love that. Where's my explosive guys? Alright. No. You're not going to be fucking firing unless I specifically want you to. You did your effect. You guys are crazy. You're going to end up killing all your own troops. That's what you always do. You had the one great explosion here, which we all remember. Okay, this is my great thing about my tactic is long Yari. Well, these guys are shorter Yari, so they're a little disadvantaged, but we just outflank them. Just keep the spear wall going.
Our general is in grave danger, my lord.
Keep the spear wall going. Keep the spear wall going, baby. Where is our general? He should be fighting. Who are these guys? Okay, I have some reinforcements I have to assess. So, ignore the bomb throwers. Do the samurai archer. Ultimately, what they should all do is just go right here. Yeah, pretty much just do that. We got this. It's already a victory. I just want to minimize loss of
My
life.
lord, a glorious victory will soon be yours.
And we're gonna get the fucking sneak attack on those guys. Speed this up a little bit. Come on, attack. You attack too. They're just inching along. That computer can't handle going ×2. They're all just routing already. Haven't even really fought them yet. You guys have to dismount or else you're gonna end up dying. Archers, run! Firebomb throwers, you guys can just chill right there, you know. Okay, now attack them in the rear. Oh. You, alright, attack him. You two, you make your way over here now. Alright, let's continue this battle. This is a massive cluster fuckerino over here. I have some cavalry. Ooh, forgot about that. Get over here. Hey, I thought I told you guys to go over here. Yeah, it's Darth Mod. I got Darth Mod and all the Radius unit packs. All my generals are on their feet because that's way safer. That way you don't have all those plus, look at those bow guys. That's what I'm thinking. Get up in there, horses. We already won. Just waiting for them to start routing. Get all these archers to shoot these archers. Ready to see some archers evaporate? There's 99 of them out of 100. Oh, there's 80. Jesus. Anyways, did we win yet? There we go. Ah, jeez. I mean, this mic. It's Sam Son. Oh, no, I hit my thing. 420 blaze it. I gotta look on Amazon. I need a new podcast to listen to now.
It's history.
Das Ergebnis der Verjütung sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in
The
Europa.
figures.
I better get to capture this.
The drama.
Marine 6. Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
The deep questions.
If we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men.
It's hardcore history.
We almost decided to ditch the topic we're talking about today earlier on in the process of creating this episode. Originally, I picked it because it's full of some of the great stories you can ever imagine. Some of the weirdest things, too, bizarre stuff. And the backdrop for these events is majestic, but it's such a complicated story and a confusing story that it proved to be daunting to try to organize it. You wanted to tell these dramatic and bizarre and interesting stories, but you needed enough of the context to really set up the drama and set up the intrigue.
There we go.
Give the events the full force that they deserve. I was having a really hard time doing that. And I'm not the only one. One of the reasons this subject isn't well known, because it's got all the elements that would make you want to know about it and somebody else want to tell you about it, is because of the complexity. There aren't even good books on the subject to recommend. The best books out there read like textbooks, and there aren't even a lot of those.
Look at that experience.
So I'm trying to figure out a novel way to tell you these stories and get you interested in this subject. And if we do a poor job of organizing
33 morale, 22
and
attack,
leave you
28
confused
defense.
at the end, just realize that that puts you in really good company, and well,
3
that's
defense.
part of the reason
4 attack.
a lot of people don't know about this. But when I say this story has everything, I mean everything. This story is like a mafia soap opera, is the best way to put it. I mean, you have body snatching, assassinations, poisonings, megalomania, bedroom politics, backstabbing, and double crossing. It's one of the fantastic time periods in history, and it didn't last very long. 30, 40 years it was over. But I'm talking about the period after Alexander the Great died unexpectedly. That is the dramatic era that set up a scramble for his empire, because he died without a proper heir. That is, well, it's like the most interesting pick-up sticks game you ever saw. Game of musical chairs where all his generals and everyone who had any of his blood in their veins were vying for their little piece of the pie. And some of these guys didn't want a little piece of the pie. Some of them wanted the whole pie. And I started thinking of all these wild questions. Because you think about what went on in 323 when Alexander the Great died, and everybody started scrambling for their piece of his pie. And you say, well, what if Napoleon had been a successful conqueror, like Alexander? I mean, if he had had to settle down for a while and absorb his empire, enjoy the fruits of his conquest as opposed to being defeated at the end. Same thing for Adolf Hitler. What if he'd been victorious and you had this giant Nazi super state, and then all of a sudden, without ever making any preparations for any succession or anything like that, Adolf Hitler just died? Who does the empire go to? How do you work that out? Well, in 323, Alexander the Great was doing fine, at least for the early part of the year. He was 32 years old, the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. Sure, he had just gotten a little bit of a setback in India. He wasn't actually defeated, but his troops didn't want to go any farther. That's what 10 or 15 years of constant warfare will do to them. And so Alexander, his amazing need to conquer everything he could find, not at all satisfied, reluctantly turned back, went back to Babylon, and for the first time since he started, pretty much since the first time he became the king in Macedonia, he sat down and had a little time to enjoy the fruits of his victory. Of course, what did he do? He started planning more conquests. That's what you do when you have an unsatisfiable need to conquer everything. The sources say that he was thinking about going west now, because most of Alexander's conquests had been in the east. You start in Greece and you move east, and that's what he did. Now he was thinking about the west, though. Maybe North Africa. Maybe Italy. Wouldn't that have changed history if Alexander conquered Carthage in 320 BC or Rome in 318 BC? And he was certainly capable of doing it. 32 years old, just reaching the height of his powers, you would think. And then all of a sudden, he dies. Think of him as the brain and this whole empire as the body. Empire of 100 million people. Bigger than the United States by quite a bit. And this area, for the first time in human history, had been united under the will of a single individual. If Alexander wanted to conquer Carthage, that was going to be the goal of all of the people in that empire. The artisans, the craftsmen, the farmers, the average people, the bureaucracy, the soldiers, everyone was going to do whatever Alexander wanted them to. He was the brain for this giant body. And all of a sudden, in 323 BC, after 12 days of a mysterious illness, the brain is gone. What happens to the body? Well, when the people around Alexander, the powerful generals and marshals, who were formidable individuals in their own right, when they realized that it was actually possible this guy was going to die, it took a few days of being seriously ill before that even entered in their heads, people started to wonder. Because not only was there a giant empire at stake, but there was a ton of money.
That's right, retreat.
That was the byproduct of all these conquests, and who was going to get all this stuff? Like I said, think of Napoleon or Hitler dying without any sort of heirs, and you just sit there for a minute and go, well, what do we do now? Is this mine or yours? And I always try to imagine what the room was like when Alexander was dying, and all these people were nervous around him, and every day were more nervous as he didn't get better. And finally, the sources, which are far from unbiased, everybody had a huge vested interest in representing these events from different viewpoints after Alexander died, so take it all with a grain of salt. But these people, the marshals, the potential successors to Alexander, came to him and said, who do you leave the empire to? And the sources say, he said, to the strongest. He might have said to the stronger. It might have been to the best. I've heard that translation. Some historians think he actually left it to one of his generals, and that the name of that general was very similar to the archaic Greek that would have said to the strongest as well. So maybe he was misheard. But in any case, that was kind of keeping with Alexander's personality. It's one of the things that makes him so compelling and interesting. He thought he was descended from Achilles on his mother's side, and Heracles on his father's side, slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, supposedly. He was the kind of guy that might have said, hey, I'm leaving it to whoever can keep it and hold it. Supposedly his last words were, I see a great contest after my death, or something to that effect. And of course that's not that unbelievable a prediction when you consider that his last will and testament is to leave this empire to the stronger. And I've always thought that Alexander the Great should be compared to a great quarterback on a great football team. He was the star player, but when he died, you have to think all these people in the room were looking at his corpse going, who's going to play quarterback now? And then a second later, after looking around the room, probably thinking, maybe I could play quarterback. And that's where the fun really starts in this whole little era that, well, a couple of eminent historians have called the funeral games, because that's how Alexander sort of phrased it. A funeral contest. I like to think of it as a chessboard, and this chessboard had been dominated by one giant piece, Alexander the Great, for quite a while. When he died, all of a sudden there was going to be a game to see who gets what Alexander had, and the only people that are allowed to play this game are the people who were either working for him as generals and marshals, or people who had his blood in their veins. And so many of the events that are so interesting to get into in this story, the reason I picked it in the first place, happen within this context. Alexander the Great conquers the known world and some of the unknown world. He dies unexpectedly. His marshals and generals fight it out, and family members get involved as well to try to figure out who gets what Alexander had. And after 30 or so years of warfare, finally there's a few of these generals left, and they found these dynasties, you know, one in the Macedonia, Greece area, another one in Asia, and another one in Egypt, that live on for a couple hundred years and are eventually taken over in wars, mostly, by the Romans. They provide the bridge from the old world to the Roman world. And this is the so-called Hellenistic period in history, where Greek ideas and culture and actual lots of Greeks transmit themselves. Actually begins a two-way transmission, I should say, from Asia to Europe and Europe to Asia. So Alexander responsible for that, and it was during the Hellenistic period after his death that this came to full blossom, I guess you could say, fully bloomed. So that's the overview. The reality, though, is when Alexander died, the events started heating up right away. Now, let's not pretend that everything had been hunky-dory before Alexander died. He had been very strange and unstable near the end of his life. A lot of historians think that his alcoholism had reached a tipping point. He was showing classic signs of megalomania and was definitely being corrupted by absolute power. The purges were happening much more often. He was killing a lot of the people who had helped him get to where he was because he was so afraid they were part of plans to overthrow him.
Jesus.
He was probably believing that he was a god. That's what the sources talk about a lot. and that was upsetting the people who worked under him. And then, near the end of his life, his right-hand man, his best friend, some historians believe his lover, Hephaestion, who he had known since childhood, dies mysteriously, very much like Alexander died, by the way. And this sends Alexander kind of over the edge. And when Alexander dies, there's a lot of speculation, again, probably very biased speculation with ulterior motives, that he may have been assassinated. I've read, and I can't remember the historian who said it, but I'm going to mangle the quote, but that assassination was sort of like a Macedonian national pastime. It's part of what makes him fun. And I've always thought, by the way, of the Macedonians as like a giant mafia crime family. I don't mean to insult anyone who calls themselves descendants of the ancient Macedonians, but when you read their histories from this time period, they're so wonderfully decadent in terms of reading. Everybody's whacking everybody else, the intrigue, the double-crossing, and the wonderfully developed, powerful characters in the story just make it like you're reading a dime novel. Especially if the historian you're reading can bring it out right. And as I said, there are very few people who even try to talk about this period. They're scared off by the complexity. But they know that there's great stories. The first thing that happens when Alexander dies, for example, is that there is a rebellion amongst his own troops. His great Macedonian army starts fighting amongst itself over who is going to succeed him, because Alexander didn't leave any proper heirs. The potential heirs were all way too young. Alexander had, for example, an illegitimate child named Heracles, just a baby.
As to the response you receive,
and he had a Bactrian princess named Roxanne, pregnant with, well, they didn't know what at the time. It turned out to be a boy that they named Alexander IV. Neither one of those children was someone who could succeed to the kingship. But Alexander also had a half-brother. Historians call him Philip Aridaeus. And the infantry of Alexander's army wanted Philip Aridaeus to be crowned king. The cavalry of the army, which was made up more of the aristocrats of the Macedonians, the infantry was more the rank-and-file people, the cavalry was going to go along with whatever these powerful generals wanted, and the powerful generals wanted a regency. What they meant by that was they were going to rule for Alexander's really young, infant heirs or unborn heirs, if Roxanne should have a boy. The regents were going to watch over things until the children came of age. Well, Alexander's infantry were not fools. They grew up in the mafia soap opera culture of Macedonia too, and they didn't trust these powerful, formidable generals to meekly hand over power to these
river
children
battle
as they grew
hype.
up. They knew a power
Can we
grab
get some
when they
river
saw
battle
it.
hype in
And
the
that's
chat?
when fighting broke out, and there was actual deaths.
It's the first
and
one this campaign.
Sieging of cities, and all kinds of interesting fighting went on before a peace was brokered. Another one of these weird stories, and I think I'll throw these in whenever I can, that when the compromise was brokered between the infantry and the cavalry of Alexander's army, in order to give it this legitimacy that only Alexander seemed to possess, they trotted out Alexander's body and sort of had it at the proceedings. So he was watching over the proceedings. And Alexander's body actually plays an important part in this story. As a matter of fact, because he was the godhead, the fountainhead of legitimacy, everybody who's trying to succeed or grab a piece of his empire tries to tie himself to Alexander one way or another. One of these generals, who was vying for his empire later, actually would tell his troops that Alexander was talking to him through his dreams. And he would transmit Alexander's orders to the troops. This isn't from me, this is from Alexander. Here's what he told me last night. Forget what he told me last week in the dream. This is new. You could see how much, though, propaganda and trying to boondoggle the average Macedonian was coming into play in these funeral games. I mean, one of the great stories in this whole thing is that when Alexander dies, they mummify his body. And they don't mummify it the old-fashioned way like they did in Egypt with bandages and stuff. They were doing this with the latest Egyptian technology, which had gotten much better than that.
Oh, God.
Some of the sources say that he was encased in honey, which would act as a preservative, and that he was put in a special sarcophagus, gold and stuff, but I think you could see him in it. And then at one point, when things break down amongst these various marshals and generals, and they start actually fighting with each other, taking troops from Alexander, splitting them up, and then going at it. Another one of these successors, behind the backs of everyone else, steals Alexander's body and takes it back to his little territory in Egypt. Because having Alexander's body was attaching yourself more to the legitimacy. And then when one of the generals, a guy named Perdiccas, found out that the body had been stolen, he was kind of hoping to be the one that had the body, he ran down to Egypt and got into a fight with Ptolemy, the one who stole the body. And eventually, Perdiccas made a terrible mistake in a battle, and 2,000 Macedonians drowned in the river or were eaten by crocodiles. The Macedonians didn't like that, so they killed Perdiccas that night, their own general. And then the next morning, went to Ptolemy and said, well, we killed Perdiccas. You want to be the regent? Because Perdiccas had been the actual regent. That was the kind of backstabbing that was going on all the time. Like I said, it was like a mafia crime family. And there were some of the most wonderful characters from history. If you were writing a Shakespearean drama, you'd want several of the people in this whole funeral game story in your play. So who were these new figures on the chessboard? Well, most of them were Alexander's generals. And there was a wild cast of characters among them. My favorite is Antigonus One-Eyed, or the One-Eyed, or Cyclops. He was called that for obvious reasons. Antigonus One-Eye was probably the general of Alexander's that came the closest to becoming the next Alexander. In all the wars he fought with all the other generals, he only lost one battle, but it was the one he died in at Ipsus in 301. Nevertheless, his kids ended up founding the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia that would exist on and off until the Romans took it over violently. And Antigonus was a big man. Eventually, at the end of his life, in the last battle, he was an 81-year-old man, enormously fat, large, one-eyed, and a visionary leader. Very ambitious. He was one of the people that vied for Alexander's throne. Another was a friend of his from childhood. Some of the historians, especially from the ancient times, seem to think that he may have even been Alexander's half-brother, Philip II's illegitimate children, Ptolemy. Ptolemy is supposed to have been a student with Alexander of Aristotle. They were as close could be. Ptolemy was one of the few bodyguards that Alexander would allow close to him armed. A right-hand man. And Ptolemy was a fascinating character because he was the only one of the successor generals, and that's what they were called, the successors to Alexander. He was the only one not to have really fallen into the trap of trying to have an army. Because if there's one thing the post-Alexander period showed, it's that all of these formidable generals had one goal, and that was to not let anyone else become the next Alexander. And so one of the reasons that the period's so complex to explain is because there were no fixed sides. The alliances kept changing in dizzying arrays to make sure that everybody ganged up on whoever the lead dog seemed to be.
Thank you.
For example, when Antigonus One-Eye made his play for Empire later down the road, everyone else ganged up against him.
It's always about the flanks, guys.
And this would be
always
repeated
get the
anytime
flanks.
anyone seemed to show
I'm gonna get my
promise
general
as
right
the
here.
next
We're gonna get the
Alexander. So try
flank.
following that. It does make for
Gotta
wonderful
win.
backstabbing, though, because
Watch this.
constant sides that had just recently been friends
See, they're already
would
nervous.
turn around and fight each other. Instead of a civil war, think about a 6 or an
They're gonna
8
wave once we get the rapid
better
advance right
idea
here.
of
My lord,
20 or so
a
years after
glorious
Alexander.
victory will
All these different
soon be
generals,
There we
all
yours.
go.
their little pieces of
There we
Alexander's
go.
empire fighting one another. Sometimes to get it all, sometimes just to expand their little piece of the pie a little bit more. Ptolemy, by the
Shaken.
way, was the one who stole Alexander's body. There was a tradition in Macedonia that
Our
the successor
general
to the
is
king
in
is the one who
grave
buries the
danger,
king.
my lord.
And so when Perdiccas, who was the regent after Alexander died, which instantly made him the lead dog, which instantly made him everybody's enemy, when Perdiccas was fighting all the other successors, or just about to, in Asia Minor, Ptolemy snuck up behind him and took Alexander's corpse back to Egypt. Who's going to bury whose successor this is what that turned out to be. And Ptolemy, by the way, is also the guy who founded the famous library at Alexandria. The one that would hold the...